David was a highly successful businessman in his early 30s. He wore expensive dark suits and lived in a beautiful apartment in the center of the city. Every morning, David looked at his reflection in the mirror with great pride. He believed that his wealth was the only measure of his value. However, David had a secret that he tried very hard to hide from his wealthy friends. His father, Arthur, was a very poor and simple man. Arthur lived in a small, quiet village far away from the noisy city. For 30 years, Arthur had worked as a humble street sweeper. He worked long hours in the cold rain and the hot sun just to earn a living. Arthur lived very simply, never buying anything new for himself. He wore the same humble, worn coat for over 10 years. But Arthur did not mind the cold or his poor life. His only goal in life was to give his son, David, a better future. Every penny Arthur saved was used to pay for David's expensive university education. When David graduated, Arthur wept tears of pure joy and pride. But as David grew richer, he also grew more distant from his father. He began to feel ashamed of Arthur's simple manners and old clothes. David stopped visiting the village, and he rarely answered his father's phone calls. He chose to forget the hands that had worked so hard to build his success. One cold winter afternoon, David was preparing for a very important meeting at his office. He was trying to win a massive contract with some of the city's richest investors. Suddenly, his secretary knocked on the door with a worried look on her face. "Sir, there is an elderly man waiting downstairs to see you," she said softly. "He says he is your father, but he does not have an appointment." David's heart sank, and a feeling of cold irritation rushed through his body. He walked down to the lobby and saw his father sitting on a luxury leather sofa. Arthur looked so out of place in the grand, modern lobby. He was wearing his old, worn coat, and his shoes were covered in mud from the long journey. His hair was completely white, and his face looked pale and deeply tired. "David, my son," Arthur said, his voice trembling with gentle warmth. He stood up slowly, trying to hug his son, but David quickly stepped back. David looked around anxiously, praying that none of his business partners would see them. "What are you doing here, father?" David whispered angrily, his voice sharp and cold. "I told you never to come to my office without calling me first." Arthur's smile faded, and a look of deep sadness filled his gentle eyes. "I am sorry, David," Arthur said quietly, holding a small paper bag in his hands. "I tried to call you, but you did not answer your phone for weeks. I just wanted to bring you some of your favorite homemade bread and see how you are." David did not look at the bag. Instead, he glared at his father's worn coat. "I am a busy man, and I do not have time for this," David said, crossing his arms. "You look terrible, and your clothes are embarrassing me in front of my clients. Please, just take your bag and go back to the village immediately." Arthur stood frozen for a moment, looking at his son with a bittersweet, heartbroken expression. He did not argue, and he did not show any anger. He gently placed the paper bag on the table, turned around, and walked out into the freezing rain. 3 weeks passed, and David completely forgot about his father's brief visit. He was too busy celebrating his new business deals and spending his money. But one morning, David received a heavy package in the mail with no return address. Inside the package, there was an old, ticking pocket watch, a small leather book, and a letter. The letter was written by a doctor from the village hospital. With trembling hands, David opened the letter and began to read the neat handwriting. "Dear David," the letter began, "I am writing to inform you that your father, Arthur, passed away last night. He had been suffering from a very serious heart illness for over a year. He knew his time was short, which is why he traveled to the city to see you one last time. He did not want to worry you or ask you for any money for his medical treatments. Before he died, He asked me to send you this package." David's breath caught in his throat, and his heart began to beat wildly in his chest. He quickly opened the small leather book, which was his father's personal journal. The pages were filled with notes about David, tracking every single one of his achievements. On the very last page, there was a message written in Arthur's shaky handwriting. "My dearest David, I know I am not a grand man, and I have always been a simple street sweeper. I know my worn coat and poor appearance made you feel ashamed in front of your wealthy friends. I am so sorry for embarrassing you at your office, my son, but I want you to know that I have always been incredibly proud of you. In this book, you will find a bank card with all the savings I have kept for you over the years. I saved this money so that if your business ever faced trouble, you would never have to worry. Please use it to buy yourself a warm coat, and remember that my love will always be with you." David stared at the page, and the cold wall around his heart completely shattered. A wave of intense guilt, shame, and sorrow washed over him. He realized that while he was busy chasing temporary wealth, he had thrown away the only true love he had. Tears streamed down David's face as he sat alone in his silent, expensive office. He fell to his knees, clutching his father's old pocket watch tightly against his chest. He wept bitterly, begging for forgiveness from a father who was no longer there to hear him. The next day, David packed a single suitcase and left his busy city life behind. He traveled back to his father's quiet, empty house in the small village. He walked into the modest living room, where everything remained untouched. On the wooden hanger by the door hung his father's old, worn coat. David walked over and gently touched the rough fabric of the coat. He realized that this simple piece of clothing was a symbol of pure, unconditional love. His father had suffered the cold so that David could feel warm. David put the worn coat over his shoulders, feeling its heavy, comforting weight. In that moment, he did not feel like a wealthy, successful businessman. He felt like a small boy who finally understood the true value of his father's sacrifice. David decided to sell his luxury apartment in the city and use his father's savings to build a charity. The charity was designed to help poor elderly people who had been abandoned by their families. David spent the rest of his life serving others, wearing his father's lessons in his heart. He finally understood that true wealth is not found in bank accounts or expensive suits. True wealth is found in the love we give, the sacrifices we make, and the kindness we show to others. We must never forget the people who helped us rise, because their love is the greatest treasure of all.